You're listening to All Things 3D, where we talk about the world of fabricating, designing, and capturing in the third dimension.
Hello, everybody. This is Mike Balzer of All Things 3D, and we've got a host, a slew of people, a slew of people that is joining us today for, I don't know, in this field behind me. No, we're not playing baseball. We are in RepRap, and it will be pretty exciting if they can join us. You know, the sad thing is, being in the middle of a cornfield, you don't have that much internet bandwidth.
They apparently are supposed to have fiber, but I don't know if it's plant fiber or fiber optic. We don't know.
Good one, Chris. On that note, I will go through really quick and introduce who we have here, and hopefully John and two other people will be able to join us, if not with video, at least with voice. So, Chris, who are you?
Yeah, so it's me again, Chris from All Things 3D, and today we're going to, like Mike said, be talking hopefully to some people that are at the MidWest RepRap Festival in Indiana, and also joining us we have Erik and Brad. Erik's joining us from the Netherlands, aren't you?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it's about 11:30 here, so nice evening call, but a great topic here. So yeah, quick introduction. I'm Erik from Ultimaker. I'm a co-founder, and but before that, actually, for quite a while, as soon as I found out about the RepRap project, I was completely amazed by what it would be able to do and the potential. But also the opportunity for me to actually work with my hands and make electronics myself, solder the boards and everything. It's something I really like doing. I like tinkering. So it was the perfect project because it was not just something that would be just an analog thing, but actually would merge the digital thing, the digital world with the analog world. And I had an IT company at the time, and I liked software, of course, but I also liked it to become a more physical thing at the same time. And I was very much aware of open source software and its power, but this was sort of the first opportunity for the open source software phenomenon to really expand into the actual physical domain. And that was just more than enough reason for me to really get into this and make this sort of the main theme of my life for the next couple of years. And it hasn't disappointed me at all. So it's been a very interesting time. The time with RepRap, especially because you also learn a lot about what it's like to be in a community where people are all collaborating and all contributing to something common that is there for everybody to use. And that sort of really inspired me to also keep that as important part of what Ultimaker is today. That we want to make sure that what we do is also a contribution to the community, but also to stay in touch with the community. And so when me and my co-founders, Martijn and Siert, started Ultimaker, it was sort of it was not really a question whether we would also release the design files that we had made. We had made them ourselves, but everything was, of course, inspired by things in the open source community. So it felt like a no-brainer, really. So yeah, I guess that's my introduction.
Yeah, and also let's not forget about software contributions as well from the Ultimaker community, or Ultimaker as a company with Cura Slicer, Cura software. It's not just a slicer; it's a full-blown driver for your printer now, and the most highly regarded, fastest slicers on the planet. So we really appreciate what you guys do at Ultimaker.
And I guess technically, interestingly,
it's really great stuff.
Marlin is probably the most used firmware on Earth, but also in space right now, which is interesting. And so the guy who made Marlin, Erik van der Zalm, he's a Dutch guy as well, coincidentally, and we were very lucky and happy to get him on board. So he's also part of Ultimaker now. So both Marlin development and Cura development came actually from the community. And we decided to embrace it instead of sort of try to make our own thing and make something better. Originally, interestingly, actually, when we when before actually it was called Cura, it was called Skane PyPy. It was a modification of SchemeForge, and at the time actually Replicator G was sort of the standard. And interestingly, with MakerBot together, I was working with Adam Mayer on Replicator G at the same time. So we were really in the open source ethos, we're really developing the same software. We were selling our own hardware that goes with it. But at that time, when we found out about Scheme PyPy, it was so much faster. And well, we really thought this is going, in terms of development, also much faster. And so we decided to switch. But yeah, I guess it's some interesting history to that. So.
Yeah, very cool. Well, thanks for sharing.
Well, let's move on to Brad. And Brad also has a very interesting open source story. If you don't know of him, Brad is the one that designed the little RP. We've had him on several times as well, so I'll give it to you.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not. I mean, how do you follow Eric? But yeah, I mean, I'm a RepRap enthusiast, like a lot of people who might be interested in this show, and I certainly, one of the things that interests me is sort of the social and community aspect to it. I mean, typically when you're working on your own project, and you can be a bit isolated. So I think it's definitely nice to sort of have these community-driven projects, and it's sort of, it takes on a life of its own, and there's other reasons why you do it other than you're trying to accomplish a goal. It's you're working with other people, and so I sort of like collecting and building different RepRap printers, and I've come up with a few of my own, or my own derivatives. But
yeah, and what's really interesting, all of us here have had some, as I call it, the open source. RepRap is part of that. There's a lot of stuff out there, and if it wasn't for the internet, even back in my day, I'm dating myself here, when I was designing my products on Genie, I don't know if some of you are familiar with that, it's a lower cost version of CompuServe.
CompuServe was my first internet. That was my first touch with the internet. That was the community. You'd go on and you chat, you dial in, and then you chat with people. You could even like play games.
Yeah.
It was like,
well, CompuServe had rip graphics.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, CompuServe had rip graphics, like vector graphics.
Yep. Yeah.
The one I remember was just like it was like a text game that we played.
Okay, well, let's move.
Yeah.
Let's really move into the three news items that I have, and one of the reasons I pick news items that are specific to the topic is the opportunity for us to kind of expound upon that. And the first item I have, and I'll fade to it in my background here, is this article from how does that pronounce? Ottawa? Yeah. Someone help me. Ottawa. Thank you. Jeez. Ottawa. As you can tell, I'm not the pronouncer in this family. Okay. However, he was given a choice, and again, the big reason I'm bringing this, because this happens over and over again. You find students, schools, in this case, a makerspace center, decided to take one of these E-Nable designs and create a 3D prosthetic for this little kid here. I'll play the video. And maybe not. There we go. And this is obviously in Canada, and there we go. So again, another child who has the opportunity to have a prosthetic, and as we all know, the reason that it's been difficult in the past is children grow so quickly. Design one, and then the next thing you know, they're going to need another one in a year or two. Becomes extremely expensive. But now with 3D printing, that is capable. And before we got started today, Erik mentioned that he has a strong involvement in the E-Nable program, and so I thought maybe he could kind of talk over this a little bit and kind of give us an idea of where Ultimaker is in assisting in this. And as mentioned in previous show, I actually met John Scholl, who is the founder and kind of the catalyst behind the whole program. Really nice guy, and we also interviewed him. So go ahead, Erik.
Well, I definitely agree that John Scholl is a great, well, I would say he's a very inspirational person and really bringing this community together in a very good way. And there are so many people around him who are also really contributing all this hard work. So I'm not going to take any claim that we're doing sort of a lot of work, but we're really definitely trying to support the E-Nable community wherever we can. So both by donating 3D printers, we've definitely tried to catalyze it and, for example, provide things like the Handomatic and, well, at least on the sidelines, work a little bit towards making it even better. Although I would say that there are so many dedicated people working to make this community work, and also I would say for the Handomatic, for example, they're really the specialists that maybe some time will actually hire some of these people because they're really good people working towards a good goal, but also skilled people. So a lot of very good resources go into this community, which is really great because it's a well deserved application to get so much attention. So there's such a tremendous opportunity here to help so many people because it's not actually a very uncommon thing. In every country there are children born with, for example, an incomplete hand, and then this is only the start of the E-Nable project because there are already, for example, other kinds of prosthetics, although they generally advise you not to call it a prosthetic because it is different than a medically certified prosthetic. So, but then again, interestingly, actually, to some extent, I would say it's really more than a prosthetic because it becomes a project which is really your own, and that's really what I would think is the special thing. Actually, a week ago on Monday, we had a conference, a little sort of a mini conference with some people in the medical community. I introduced them to the E-Nable project as well, and interestingly, they were actually really looking for this this sort of skin flesh-colored prosthetic, and they thought this is the goal, this is what we should aim for, and this is what we should be trying to 3D print. And I really told them that you see so much pride in not actually wanting to hide the fact that you have a prosthetic, but actually showing it off, and that means that's completely the difference in the mind of the child, that it's not something to be ashamed for. It's actually something you're special about.
You are totally right, yeah. Erik. You're totally dead on. I'm working with a kid right now, and we're printing him one of the Cyborg Beast hands, and he is like so amped. And his dad has been calling me, hey, when are the parts going to be ready? When are the parts going to be ready? Because his son keeps hounding him like, hey, when are we going to get this? And he's really into Spider-Man right now, so he wants Spider-Man colors.
Yeah.
And they have, Iron Man ones now that are fully functional, like the light blaster and the little laser thing. I mean, it's cool. It's like and you're totally right. Instead of being a prosthetic where it's just kind of like something that is like you can tell somebody's handicapped. It's not. Instead of being handicapped, you could make it so much more. And you could actually make it stronger than a regular hand, or you could have it have more functionality. You could have it have a drill built into it, or whatever. Who knows? It'll have more functionality than a regular hand.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Oh, and even it sounds a little bit like it's more of a boy thing, but interestingly, I printed one for a little girl, and she chose the colors, and well, interestingly, when you involve the child, it really becomes something differently. So she chose pink and green, and I thought, okay, this is not gonna look well, but it looked really great. So and she really liked it because she had an influence on what it should be like, and it's only the start right now because it would have been quite easy actually to add her name to it or add some decorations and everything, but this is already what she identified with. So yeah, it's not just a superhero boy thing, but it's also to have something special you chose yourself. So yeah, that's what I really like about it.
Yeah, E-Nable's a great project.
Yeah. Also, the tremendous cost savings to go down from about 8,000 or more dollars or euros, and it's down to about 50. And so that's just such a difference. It's just amazing. And so even in the Netherlands, for example, a prosthetic device for a child would be very expensive for parents. But actually, in this case, it's not really a cost that you really have to think about anymore at all. So
Right.
no reason not to go for it. Even if you're not using it all the time, you could experiment with it. So that's really great. And then especially in countries where poorer countries, then it's probably the only option. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's the point. In poorer countries, this is really becoming a kind of a life of its own, and giving people the ability. And I do want to agree with both of you that it has become a badge of honor, and you don't have to hide it. And one of the things that I thought about using was scanning, so that you could scan the person's normal arm and use that, but we're finding out that that's not necessarily the direction. So let's kind of move on to the next item, and kind of introduce something that I think all of us have been aware of, and that's Instructables. And Instructables, I guess, is kind of like a leader in the open source how-tos, and there's a lot of people who have put a lot of different things that provide tools and other type of things. I know that there are other sources out there that provide how-tos. In fact, you have one that allows you to get 3D parts. What's the name of it again, Eric?
It's Umagine. Yeah.
Umagine. We've talked about that a number of times. But these places that you can actually get parts and rebuild them or redesign them. But in this case, this was an article on somebody who's developed a little scanning platform. If you're into 3D scanning, I actually have two moving platforms or rotating platforms, and they can be quite expensive. And the only other person that I know who's created one of these is the great Fradini. Do you remember him, Chris?
Yeah.
He had his own little one and a hand crank to vertically move his scanner, but he was a kick. Actually, I should have had him come on. But so this I thought was kind of neat, because this guy has taken a 12-volt, obviously high torque motor. I'm wondering how much weight he can actually support on this, so maybe I'll contact him. And then he's got obviously a power supply, an Arduino, but he added something nifty to the Arduino, and that is the ability, using one of the ultrasonic sensors, so that when you step on it, it would detect a change in the ultrasonic pattern, and then it would trigger the motor and then cause it to spin. So I thought that was kind of neat. He does talk about how he uses Bluetooth. Here's another image of it behind me. If you've ever seen one of these, it looks like two little eyes from what's that robot in that?
Wall-E.
Wall-E, yeah. It should have the voice. Okay, step on. He actually didn't talk to me. Oh well. Now he has a voice. Okay. But what's interesting is that it talks about the ability here to modify it, and I think this is one of the fun things, and we can also talk about the maker movement in itself, but it's to get people together, sites together, to kind of show your designs, your efforts, and then have them be manipulated or changed. And I know that Brad, part of the reason that you created the little RP was based upon a community. Chris, I know you've talked about it several times, and then Eric, obviously, you've kind of founded an area that allows people to get together. So does anybody want to kind of expound upon this? Do you know of your own sites that you've worked with? Yeah, Brad, I'm going to let you talk. You're kind of hidden back there, and that fly on your chest is starting to get to me. No.
Well, I mean, there's a number of communities that I've been active in, and I mean, one of those is, I mean, obviously there's the RepRap forum, which is online. That's sort of like one of the more original ones. There is also there's a number of active IRC groups, like there's a RepRap IRC group, but often too a lot of the open source manufacturers will have their own channel. There will also be some channels that are unique to different technologies. So like one of the ones that I'm in constantly is I think it's DIY 3D printing. Oh, what is it? It's
DLP SLA or
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what the name of it was. It is
The one I always talk to you in?
it's DLP 3D printing. And
DLP
what's
3D
interesting
printing.
too is it's kind of, you know, since these communities have sort of a low barrier to entry, and it's not, you know, you can be as active as you want to be. Then a lot of times you'll have access to sort of larger names that you wouldn't normally have access to. So I mean, even in the DLP 3D printing channel, you know, both of the main U.S. makers of UV resin are in there, and so you can sort of have really good access to it. And even with Ultimaker, the Eric Zalm, he's often on IRC. So I mean, you can sort of ask these people, you know, really direct questions. Whereas, you know, in a more traditional company, it's like you wouldn't have not only would you not know who made a particular item, because for example, you know, like HP doesn't say, oh, this cartridge was made by you know, Chris Smith, you know, and here's his email address, and
Right.
so it's really useful in that way. And the Google Plus community has gotten bigger and bigger.
Yeah, that's what I use, and I have to agree with you. And it's pretty easy to set up a forum there. And what's nice is that they have a system that if you want to, anything that comes into either a thread that you've created or all the general threads for that particular forum, you'll get emails on them, and then you can actually reply directly to the email, and it gets contributed back to the forum. So I think that's kind of neat. Yeah, you talked about IRC. What is IRC, Brad?
IRC is
Internet relay chat.
It's a way you would download illegal software 20 years ago.
It is.
It's internet relay chat. So it's like a historical chat room platform that people still sort of use.
It existed
Sort of,
before the World Web,
Yep.
actually.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Eric. It was one of the precursors to the World Wide Web. It was used extensively back then. What's funny, though, is the foundation for RepRap and open source, it's still very viable, still used a lot, and many people set up their own IRC channels, their own little servers. So, you know, while I've got you up on the screen, why don't you kind of talk a little bit about Umagine, because, you know, that is a repository and a place for people to go to find things and make comments. So kind of, I'm giving you a little sales pitch ability here.
Well, we're doing quite a lot of things at the Umagine side, although not everything is as visible. But what we're trying to really support is the collaboration, like things in the community, like in an E-Nable community. But there has to be a place where the knowledge and design files gets consolidated. And so, for some reason, for some people, Thingiverse is not the best place to go anymore. And we're really trying to be the best place to go, not just in terms of functionality, but also we're trying to, for example, set up a license which will be robust for 3D printable items. So 3D printing design files, you don't necessarily want the exact same license, the same open source license, for example, for physical objects. For objects that you could make physical, because there are differences in liability, for example, or possible liability at least, and the fact that normally something just based in copyright law would work actually, but in this case there's another field which is patents, so there's another IPR related thing in there. So we're trying to create a license that will support the creation of 3D design files, and will also protect, to some extent, to the extent possible at least, the maker of this, because somebody might actually make a hand and, for example, get injured because they just printed it completely wrong, or they printed it at a scale it wasn't designed for, and then might actually sue the person who designed it because he should know, for example, right? And these kinds of issues don't really appear with, for example, somebody sharing an image which might be copyrighted, and somebody else will take that image and do something with it. It will not actually hurt people. And with actual physical objects, there's a difference there. So that's one of the things we're doing as well with Umagine. We're also creating, for example, a viewer, and we'll have some exciting news very soon about this, which is really going to be not just a viewer for a single object, but really for assemblies, but also the ability to comment on a 3D file take measurements, do lots of very interesting things. And so that's something we're releasing in the next couple of weeks. So that will be pretty exciting. So
well,
it will
I hope
be
you
a
can
great
come
way
on
to collaborate. Yeah.
Eric, I hope you can come on as one of our guest crashers in the future and kind of promote that a little bit. I'd like to hear more about that. Okay, so let's kind of move on to the next thing. You know, it was great for you to come on because one of the things that people have been concerned with in this industry is, you know, we have this community, we come up with a lot of great ideas. You know, what is protecting us from somebody else taking our stuff and profiting on it? And you know, I like to use MakerBot as the example because a lot of people in the RepRap community don't have a lot of nice things to say about MakerBot because they kind of borrowed some things, closed off their system, and you know, they say it was to protect the interest of their user, but a lot of people feel they profited from it. And you know, we have another company that Eric runs called Ultimaker, who obviously puts a lot back into the open source community, as well as, I'm hoping, making a profit on a really good 3D printer. So there's different models there, and you know, time will tell who wins out. But if you talk to any of the RepRappers, they had a festival, where was it, in Madrid, and they had somebody tweeting how, yep, there goes that MakerBot printing in the air again. I guess even with the smart extruder, it wasn't extruding very well, so I thought that was kind of amusing. Even though my little replicator 2 has worked fine, supposedly there's been some issues with the closed system on the newer ones, but you know, that's hearsay. They do look nice, but I think there could be some problems, and where maybe an open source community who had more involvement in the design of it may have avoided that. But who knows? So let's kind of get on to something else. And you know, Chris and I have covered Autodesk quite a bit in the last year, and one of the reasons for it is that Autodesk is really appealing to the person that's just starting out. They've got a lot of free applications out there. And this is something that I just saw not too long ago, and it's called Tinkerplay. But I think it borrows from, at least from what I read, from the same people who made Tinkercad. But you know, if you're looking at this on the screen, essentially you can assemble little parts together to come up with your own figures that you pop together, and is fully articulated. And you know, we've had some 3D artists on who created things like this, but I think it's pretty fun that you could literally on your tablet come up with these own little characters.
And then it spits it out on your 3D printer. You can have your own little figurine that you make. It's pretty awesome.
Action figure. So you know, they've done a lot of things like that, and plus they've got this Spark program where they, you know, not only are supporting people through their forums with it, but I guess there's some financial funding and some expert backing on it. They've come out with their own SLA printer that I've heard and seen the results that are really good, and coming back with the community from the open source on how it was made. They just released last week their open source chemical process for their own SLA material. I don't know if you saw that, Brad. So, I mean, they're wanting to push back in it. We've had numerous interviews, but the last one we had, gosh, the name escapes me, but we had the actual CEO of Autodesk, who really seemed like a down-to-earth type of guy. Likes to work in his garage with his woodworking, and just thought it would be a great idea to contribute back to the community. So are we going to see more of this where larger companies are going to get involved working with the open source? Is Autodesk an anomaly here? I'll start with you, Brad.
It's tough to say. I mean, I think that even there's been some. I mean, there's a couple things. One, you mentioned that there's the sort of the open source UV resin that Autodesk announced, and it's kind of like double-edged because it's a lot of these are chemicals that people probably shouldn't really be playing with unless they have a sort of a good working knowledge. Like, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the formula, but it's pretty strange. So it's tough to say. Also, too, I don't know that Autodesk is going to come out of this super unscathed either. I know that at the latest, there's sort of like I don't know what it's called, but there's a UV curable like consortium almost, and they have a conference, and Autodesk was there, and it was sort of alluded to that They're going to end up in a legal battle with B9, maybe over the slide release. I hope it works out for them. It's also, I think their sales haven't been that great either, primarily because of the pricing on the devices. It's high comparatively, but it's tough because they're trying to compete with open source companies, a lot of whom don't have the overhead and aren't necessarily planning to have like a long-term prosperous company, so they can sort of work on really low margins.
I don't know. You know somebody that's doing that, Brad? Maybe it's called Little RP. I don't know.
Yeah. Would I do it again for the same margins? I don't know.
Another good point, though. Autodesk does have a little bit of deep pockets, so this has been an experiment for them. But in talking with their CEO, and Chris, do you remember his name? Because I'm being stupid here.
Carl Bass.
Anybody?
Carl Bass.
Thank you, Carl. He just really seemed down to earth.
Carl
and I really think genuine that he wants this to be a part. But as you said, Chris, it's a lot of money. I wanted to get an Ember, but it was $6,000. It was a little on the pricey side. And as you said, you can get a Form 1 for, what is it, $3,500. You can get yours for $750. I don't remember what the exact price.
I don't see this as actually a failure for Autodesk to actually sell the machine. I don't think it's their intention to really be a seller of 3D printers themselves, because they would also be in a channel conflict with a lot of the companies they work with. But at the same time, because if they're also a software maker and 3D printer maker, they kind of do everything, and that can become threatening to other people in the industry. But apart from that, they're really trying to catalyze this industry by creating a reference example for DLP-based 3D printing. And actually, what they're saying is really that anybody can implement this and anybody can start selling this. And they just wanted to make sure that there's a good interface with their Spark platform and everything. At least that's what I've sort of heard.
Yeah, and it kind of appears to me like that maybe it's exploratory for themselves, because I think I'm expecting the SLA movement to kind of grow in a similar pattern that we've seen, FTM and FFF grow in the last 5 years. Is we're going to see more machines. I mean, you saw that yesterday we talked about the Carbon 3D printer. So I think the SLA technology is just going to keep evolving, and I think Autodesk, being they're software pioneers and being who they are, to innovate and kind of keep ahead, pioneering in the software kind of sector, they have to stay up to date with hardware and fully understand hardware like at a fundamental level. And so I think that might be pretty much like where they're going with that whole Ember program, is to more fully understand. Because remember, even Tatiana said, she was kind of telling us that like they like to put themselves in the customer's shoes a lot, so that they can see, they can know the problems that their customers are facing on a daily basis, so they can help implement solutions. So yeah, I think Erik, you're definitely on the right. I think you're dead on with that.
Yeah, and actually, in talking with a few of them, including, as they call themselves, a 3D printer scientist, they're working on a lot of things. Obviously, the Ember is what came about, and as you indicated, it is true. I think it's a loss leader. It was just an opportunity to put some time and effort into a SLA-type printer, try and sell it, but that is not their major goal. I don't know if you're aware of this, but they're also working on an SLS printer. They're also working on an SLS that'll do metal. So they've got a lot of things that they're working on, and they're experimenting. And as you mentioned, knowing how the printers work allows them to create the software to drive those printers. And if they can contribute back to the community, it makes them look like, the good guy in all this. And I think that's super. But another thing I want to talk about, other than Autodesk, is, well, what about Stratasys? We did know that they bought out MakerBot. 3D System is trying to get into the personal and prosumer 3D printers, but they're pretty much a closed society. In fact, both of them try to minimize what kind of material you can use with their printers unless you buy it from them. I don't know of anybody else, but those are the two big ones. Do you think they're going to open up a little more, or do they appear to be threatened and they're closing themselves off more? Anybody want to add to that? And before I continue, I'm getting a response from Erik on this. I want to let my audience know that I apologize. We were hoping to have John from CME CNC come on live from the MidWest RepRap Festival, as well as two other people to join him, Erik Lean, which we had on the show before, and Martin Bondius, who from the Bondtech extruder. And sadly, they don't have enough internet to supply the capabilities to do this. And I guess it's pretty crazy there. So crossing fingers that they will join us a little bit later. But if not, we're just going to continue head on. They're going to have some actual video up on YouTube. I'll make sure I get some links in the show notes for that. But from what I've heard, it seems to be a spectacular thing. So if you're in that area and have nothing better to do, drive on over there. Go ahead and support them. I really appreciate that, and I know John will as well.
Nobody has anything better to do than go to the MidWest RepRap Festival.
Yeah, well, I'm pretending like I'm there. All right, let's get back to the question, Erik. What do you think of these larger companies? I know that, in your position, you probably have had to deal with them in the past. Do you feel that they're feeling threatened and they're going to be pushing more with, legal ramifications and
I'm not really sure, but I think they're also seeing that the whole 3D printing industry has become something that's usually been called rapid prototyping, rapid manufacturing, and now everybody knows about it. So they probably recognize that the RepRap community and everything, all of the companies around it, including MakerBot, have really sort of created a different kind of market, which they didn't actually necessarily see at first. And now actually it becomes an important market as well, because it's also sort of the first way you get in touch with 3D printing. First you get in touch with it not as a professional, but really as something that's a sort of a normal thing for anybody who's a little bit tech savvy to play with. I think they also recognize the benefits of a whole community really also popularizing something like 3D printing. Of course, they might actually see some threat at the same time. There's a technology that's becoming democratized, so the cost is going down. And for example, companies like Stratasys and 3D Systems, they're not the best at making very cheap machines, probably. Because they've been they've been growing into a market which has very high demands on tolerances, for example, and that can actually afford to buy machines that are $30K or more, for example. And so that makes it more difficult to actually go down. And as you see, is actually that if Stratasys buys a MakerBot for a huge amount of money, they actually see this as an opportunity also to sell machines that have a lower price point, which they might not necessarily be able to make themselves that quickly, at least. So you can actually go down in terms of price point for your units, but not just very easily and very quickly. And so this was a good way, and in the same way, 3D Systems is actually acquiring companies from this whole open source movement. So even the bot objects, for example, would be an example of a 3D printer that's at least different from all of the rest, but it also has its roots in the RepRap community to some extent. So they get these opportunities because of the RepRap community, and yeah, I'm not sure whether they really cherish it as much, but at least they see it.
And I agree with you, and obviously MakerBot is a fine example of what Stratasys did in order of acquiring them and then obviously putting out MakerBot. But they also think that might be part of the problem with their latest MakerBot extruders having the issues they did when they first were released. They obviously had ability to cross-utilize patents, but they're in it for the big game. So what happens when you start collecting all these open source companies? Do we start losing it? Is this akin to the computer where you had a whole bunch of loosely based computer companies out there, free-spirited, and then little by little, what do we have? Microsoft, Dell, who else? HP. The big companies. Did we stifle it, or did we just find something else to invent, like 3D printing? So, Brad, wake up over there. What do you have to say on this?
I don't know. It's tough to say. I mean, I think a lot of these companies are trying to reinvent themselves in sort of a new market atmosphere. I mean, you've seen, and I think even 3D Systems has said that the traditional patent system isn't working for them, and it's like, how do you compete with companies that are more rapidly emerging or in countries that don't necessarily have as strong of a IP respect, things like that. So it's how do you remain relevant? And I didn't want to sort of insinuate that Autodesk is trying to make money on the Ember, but I think that they thought that they might have sold more units by now, or just have more units get out there. But ultimately, I mean, they're a software company, and they're trying to sort of create relevancies that way. So I think it's it's a weird time for these traditional companies that have had sort of patenting new technology and then sort of riding that out to sort of completion, and that's sort of, it seems like the product cycles now are not really in line with that. So it's kind of like it's a weird situation for them to be in too, as far as like, how do you remain relevant? How do you remain still maintain like a capital stream that you can continue to run your company on? I think it's just kind of a weird time.
Yep, I think so. And like I said, though, it's played out before. So, Chris, I'll give you the last word on this.
Well, yeah, I kind of agree with Brad and Eric. Is how do you worldwide, intellectual property? I would say that I agree with the statement that the intellectual property system, at least in the United States, is completely broken in many ways, and it really doesn't serve the general Joe Schmo person when it costs upwards of $25,000 to $40,000 to file an article, a patent article that's even enforceable, and it's upwards of $1 million on average to even defend a patent. The general person just doesn't have the resources to defend a patent. So really, what is the intellectual property system doing? Who's it really protecting? And it's really protecting big corporate America, which again goes back to the political system we live in, which is that's exactly what the political system is doing. The same thing. It's protecting the big corporations. And what we're seeing with the 3D printing movement is the exact opposite. It's decentralization of what used to be proprietary manufacturing methods, and it's bringing what used to be $1 million methods of manufacturing right to everybody's living room. And so a lot of these ideas of intellectual property are getting thrown right out the window. And what Brad was saying was, hey, how do you, where there's no legal framework in these third world countries, now you can have a little MakerBot or an Ultimaker or a little RP in Africa printing out prosthetics, helping somebody, and patents really become irrelevant. So I just think it's an exciting time for all of us to be living in.
Yeah, that's a good.
I'd like to add something, because
sure.
Patents are not an irrelevant thing. I think there's another way, and that's really sort of outpacing their traditional way of doing things. But at the same time, patents are for companies, for example, like us, we're seeing a big problem that there's a real big wave of patents that is just being filed right now, and you only know about it a little bit later. So there might be lots of technologies that people are getting into that might actually become off limits for companies because they're being heavily patented. And we've seen it before that there have been patents, and actually the RepRap community has grown so fast because some of the major patents that are sort of foundational to FDM, for example, or FFF, that those have become expired, and it's to some extent, for example, this sort of hard to assess risk for somebody who gets into a business. So the new entrants in an industry they might find it very challenging to base their technology on something that is patented, and so they might not actually get into this. And even though it would be very, very healthy for not just in the long run the consumer, but actually for the whole industry to have lots of new entrants to keep this industry competitive. So I can say enough things about patents that they, in general, for society, are not necessarily good. They're also not good for an industry, and we're also seeing that, at least at Ultimaker, that we haven't needed any patents to be successful. So it's good to see that there's proof of that as well. At the same time, there is a reality that there are a lot of patents, and there will be a lot more patents in the 3D printing industry. And I think this is a serious reality and problem that we have to face. And I don't necessarily think that the patent is the thing that is wrong. It's really the behavior of companies that have patents. So an offensive patent approach is a real big problem. There are also reasons for patenting something to really prevent that something can be patented by somebody who is offensive. Then again, you have to really make a claim about what you would do with that patent if you just use it defensively and not offensively. So then, you have to really be clear about what you want to do about that. Companies like RepRap do that very well. They have a promise out there that tells them we're almost required in this market to have patents and to make sure that there's a defense capability for Linux, for example. So it kind of makes sense, and it will be a very interesting time looking forward. But it's not an easy way to go forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. And what I'm going to get into right now is we're going to kind of talk about how the RepRap community started, but I think we've kind of walked around that. Essentially, as Erik mentioned, a lot of the patents did expire, which gave people an opportunity to start looking at it and experimenting with it. And obviously, when you got a bunch of experimenters doing the same thing, you can develop a community. But if some of you have some personal experience with that, please kind of talk about it. But we're probably about 40 minutes into this, so we're going to kind of move on to some other topics, and then we can jump back to that. But I wanted to just kind of point out, in the computer market, we've seen something similar between Microsoft, Google, and Apple, where they've taken a defensive posture. In fact, in my own case, with the 3D scanner, I work with a company called Occipital, and I've developed a lens system, but the people that hold the patents to their scanning system is Apple now, and they've been fairly defensive with it, and there is no sign that they're actually going to develop anything, but they really halted any further open source functionality with the structure scanning process. The whole website is gone now from PrimeSense. The OpenNI that they developed is completely gone. Luckily, it was forked off, and Occipital made their own OpenNI too, but it literally has just been wiped off the face of the earth, and that's a concern that I have with larger companies. And I have my own opinions of Apple, but I will move on from there. So let's kind of look at, do people get 3D printing? My wife tried to discuss it with somebody about 3D printing, and they just said, why don't they just copy it or use a copier? Some people just don't understand it. I mean, as part of the RepRap community, or the open source community, and Chris and I, we had our user group going on. We do this podcast, and we try to get the word out, but it's really hard for people to kind of get their hands around the whole subject. So I will start with you, Chris, and then I will move to Erik.
Well, yeah. Well, I think that 3D printing, might actually confuse some. That's why I kind of interchange it with additive manufacturing. I think additive manufacturing is a little bit more descriptive and kind of puts it more in like a machine shop category, because a 3D printer is kind of a piece of machinery. I guess a printer is a piece of machinery as well, but it's just maybe a little bit more descriptive to call it additive manufacturing when you're like adding material, and physically building an object. Most people, I guess, would equate printing to maybe something that you would read, like it's more equated to, books, or pamphlets, or some graphic process.
That's a good point, Chris, because you don't say, oh, I'm going to go use my 2D printer now. You know, so
yeah, so I think a lot of times people think, oh, it's like some sort of holographic process, but it's amazing to me because, you know, a couple weeks ago I was up in the Bay Area and I was given a talk to a bunch of retired engineers, and they were there with their spouses, and it was all people, you know, in their 60s and 70s. And if I would have given that same talk 3 years ago, at the beginning of the talk, I'd say, you know, who here has heard of 3D printing? If 3 years ago, no one, or maybe one or two of the engineers would have raised their hand, and now everyone in the audience knew immediately what 3D printing was. So I think a lot of the mystique has disappeared, and most everybody knows what it is nowadays.
Brad, you want to add to this?
Well, interestingly, actually, I remember that in about 2008 when I was showing my 3D printer. Almost everybody who came up to the printer said, "Oh, what is this?" And then there were some people who actually came to the printer and they said, "Oh, I know what this is. This is a milling machine." So basically, they started describing it. You're removing material, right? And saying, "No, I'm building it up layer by layer." And then interestingly, actually nowadays. I've seen explanations of milling machines and 3D machines that they're saying this is a very revolutionary thing. It's like 3D printing, but it actually removes material. Times have really changed.
Went the other way.
Right.
That's pretty funny.
Training CNC based off of 3D printing. So I think we've come a long way in just a few years, actually, in just 5 years or something. It's gone from just being completely something nobody actually really knew about to something that it has actually, especially in the Netherlands, has become a regular topic of discussion. So I think a lot more countries will get a lot of TV exposure by things that happen, like the E-Nable project, sadly also by guns being printed and things like that. But I think it's getting a lot of attention. Some of it is definitely well deserved, and that will really make the general public make it well known. But you're right, actually, Chris, that there's a little bit of a problem that printing is definitely associated with sheets of paper, basically, and that makes it confusing. I think people do get the 3D part and don't necessarily think they're thinking of holograms, but yeah, the paper problem is still there, and so additive manufacturing is helpful. At the same time, I think where we're going, it's not really manufacturing technology, it's really more like the 2D printer that people have, that you push a button and then the thing that you want, it comes out. So in that sense, I remember that I sort of made the choice when people were saying RepRap that rapid prototyping would be sort of too intimidating for people, and you want this to become something which people can imagine they would use themselves. And so that's why 3D printing did really make sense, because it definitely has a different potential compared to CNC, for example. CNC definitely is a piece of machinery. You have to have bigger chunks of material in the right size, bigger than the thing you want to build, and it is very different from loading a spool of material. You have to fixture your objects. You have to do a lot of, for example, zeroing. It's very different from 3D printing right now. So, yeah.
Okay, Brad, you want to add to this?
Well, I mean, it's like $1 billion question. I think that kind of where we're at with the 3D printing right now is everybody wants a 3D printer, but they don't know why they want one or what they're going to do with it. And I think that now that we get people with them, you know, hopefully we get more projects like E-Nable, or you know, just things where there's an actual like application for it that people can be interested in, other than I mean, how many tree frogs can you print? Or you know, so
little lawn gnomes, yeah.
I mean, that's going to be that. I mean, that's the tough question for FDM, I think, or you know, or for hobbyist FDM, and hopefully, I think that a lot of the new materials that are coming out are going to sort of ease that requirement, sort of open up some flexibility to that. Because I mean, traditionally, these parts, you know, that have come off, you know, these ABS parts that have come off FDM machines in the past are, I mean, they're rapid prototyping. They're not necessarily meant, you know, it's more for like fit and function. It's not something that necessarily has a long-term use. It's more just sort of like engineering, you know, before I go to the next step, this is a useful tool. So it's kind of breaking that paradigm down a little bit and saying, well, that's not why we're using it. So here are this is why we're using it, and these are the materials available, and coming up with new ideas that way I think will be useful.
Okay. Well, let's get into our last question, and that is, has the educational market benefited from the RepRap movement or the open source movement? I'll start with you, Erik, because I know that in Europe there really has been a big push to make this happen in the school systems. So what do you think? You think the open source and RepRap has really been involved with it and has helped move it along in the educational system?
Well, we're seeing an opportunity to not just teach that people will have freedom in the physical world if they design something and they can actually make the physical object. That's not the only thing they can do. They can also share it. And I think open source is not the thing that made it possible for education, but I think it will amplify what education can mean. Because I think we're going into a world, you already saw sort of the traditional giants, Stratasys and 3D Systems, they're figuring out and they're trying to really get this community aspect of 3D printing and open source hardware and open source. But really the newer companies, they're very quickly to adapt it. And you're seeing this shift towards communities producing things that are in many cases better than what some specialists can produce in a very focused, narrow, commercialized environment. So while we're seeing this shift, I think it's good to educate kids right now to work in this new kind of area where collaborating is actually allowing you to really stand on the shoulders of giants. So I see the opportunity more in what education can be changed into and inspired by than necessarily that it's, well, I think 3D printing has become democratized thanks to open source. And to that extent, it's helped education also because it's always they're always sort of in trouble because it's very expensive to start 3D printing normally, but now it's become a lot more affordable for schools because schools are always strapped for money. So, yeah.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah, well, I think that obviously it's obvious to me that the schools are benefiting from this. We're seeing a lot more kids getting back into the maker type things, and it's not just 3D printing. I'll feed off of what Erik said with the democratization of the technology. I mean, we've seen the decentralization of this information with the internet, and now with machinery manufacturing with the 3D printers. But we're also seeing the decentralization of education itself, because with now a kid can go and, or not just a kid, but an adult can go get a college education almost for free online, with things like Coursera. I mean, you can take a calculus course for free, learn calculus from the ground up, or chemistry, or whatever subject you want. You don't even need to go to university. You don't need to spend money on room and board. You don't have to change your work schedule. You can do it when it fits. You can go watch the lectures on your own time. So we're kind of seeing a shift in education, kind of the way that and I think that 3D printing is there, but the way that our current education paradigm is set hasn't quite shifted to the full extent that we'll see it go in the next few years to take advantage of things like 3D printing. I think we're seeing 3D printers move into the education system, but I think the education system is going to have to make some major changes before we're going to see like a real the full extent of the impacts.
Brad?
I mean, I think it's one of these things that's going to have to, it's like iPads in classrooms, right? I don't know that we're going to see results right away. I mean, I think that the important thing that say, if we're looking at democratized and relatively affordable rapid prototyping tools available for educational use will provide. And I think a lot of that has to do with maybe changing the mindset of the students as they go through school as to like what is available for them to sort of explore their creativity. And I think that as they get older, that's when we're going to start seeing the rewards of this whole movement. And I think that, expecting something overnight, it's not, I think we're going to have to wait for these younger students to sort of mature a bit and having grown up with this technology before we'll really see what's capable of it. Yeah.
Very good. Well, what I'm trying to do right now is look up and see if I can find some images out at the RepRap Festival. And
I found some on Hackaday. Apparently, there's a gigantic 3D printed clock that looks like chocolate.
okay.
That was one of the cool things. And one thing that I did want to touch on was MakerOS, which apparently there's not a lot of details about it, but they're one of the sponsors of the MidWest RepRap Festival that I had not heard of. They were right on the sponsor affiliate webpage for the MidWest RepRap Festival at, I think it's MidWestRepRapFest.org. If you check out their sponsors, MakerOS, so if you go to MakerOS.com.
Send me the link, Chris, and I'll put it on the screen.
Yeah, so it's up, MakerOS.com is right in our chat window here. And so it looks like it's an operating system built from the ground up by a company, Manulith. They're out of Detroit, and they're kind of doing the same thing we are, service bureau. They create 3D content. And offer 3D printing services in Detroit. Well, apparently they've unveiled this MakerOS. Well, they haven't unveiled it, but they've given a little preview on their website, and I bet they're demoing it. I can't wait to kind of hear from some people that are seeing what it is. It looks like some sort of operating system where you can, it'll kind of, it's all-inclusive software that you can kind of bid projects and, take payment for 3D printing service bureaus or 3D CAD shops, kind of like what I do. Yeah, kind of like what I do for my profession. And so it looks like it might have some promising features. So I'm real interested to kind of hear from them what they're doing at the Midwest RepRap Fest. And so maybe we'll follow up with them. But yeah, and I think that there's obviously a whole slew of people. You've got See Me CNC, our friends from See Me CNC. Matter Hackers is there. Those guys are great. We've got Lulzbot and E3D. Ultimaker didn't quite make it this year, did they, Eric?
I don't know if we have any present there. I don't think so. Yeah.
Ultimachine is there, but no Ultimaker.
Well, they're friends of ours, but
yeah, but Ultimaker might be there next year. This show is kind of a little bit more underground. I like to equate it to maybe the Maker Faire Bay Area maybe 5 years ago. Maybe in the beginning, before it was really as crowded as it is now. Because now it's everybody goes. It's still a hoot. It's still a really good time, but it's just a lot of people. This is kind of more. I think they were expecting about 3,000 people at this turnout. But you've got Talman and B3 is going to be there. 3D Hubs is there. The guys from Smoothie Board, Maker's Toolworks is there, and another little new kid on the block, Fusion 3. So some cool guests, and it's just a fun gathering. And the cool thing about these shows is you get to go and interact with the people one-on-one and kind of meet them face to face and see the people behind them. Kind of like when we go to the shows and meet Eric or meet some of the people behind these companies, because they are real people and they're the ones that are innovating, pioneering this whole movement.
Yep. There's a few videos up there from the Midwest RepRap already, so if you wanted to head out there, let's see if I can play one on the Lowe's scanner. That's interesting.
That's from last year.
Oh, geez. I guess I won't be playing that one. Okay. Well, I apologize for that. There doesn't appear to be anything for this year yet. Duh. Okay. I'm not following very well. So one other thing before we quit today, what is your favorite open source project, device, scanner, printer, software? Yeah, software. I'll start with you, Eric. And you can't use your own product.
What? Come on.
I'll go for OpenSCAD. I still love it. Because I have a programming background. I like the way it's parametric, very direct, and you can have sort of diffs of your source code, and people can really innovate on physical objects, really in the way that they innovate on, I would say, source code in regular sense. So that's a really great project. You can do a lot with it. We're sort of trying to build on that to really make our own product out of it, but still really make that accessible for everybody. So.
Yeah, how's that coming, by the way? You mentioned that, gosh, a little while back, and so have you made any progress on your variant of this?
Well, the thing we're announcing is sort of the first version of that. It's really more the viewer component, which is becoming also a collaboration tool. And then we're actually really moving towards having full editing capabilities and really being able to start off even with a blank slate, but also being able to edit objects really like you're editing the source code of a physical object. So not starting off with the STL all the time, and really which is hard to do anything with actually, except for possibly scaling it. But yeah, we're really trying to move towards allowing people to take an object and really make a sort of a small change, a big change, change this to parameter, yeah, to be able to do that. And so of course, it'll have really good integration with Imagine. At the same time, everybody will be able to make tools with the same level of integration as well. So.
Sounds great. How about you, Brad?
Me? No, one of the things that hopefully when I'm done shipping, I plan to hopefully be done shipping all these kits out at the end of the month, so I'll have some free time to start looking at, start playing with stuff that's out there. And one of the things that's really high on my list is there was this really funky printer that came out a while ago called the SmartWrap, I think. It's kind of strange, but they've come out with one called the SmartWrap Core. So it's a nice, inexpensive Core XY based printer, and it uses a larger than normal induction probe on it for the leveling system, so you can actually level through. You can level through glass. That's probably going to be one of the first things that I'm going to build next couple weeks. It's super inexpensive, and if you want to look it up, and it's all open source, and it's all parametric.
What is it again?
It's called the SmartWrap Core, and it's all the files are parametric too. So if you want to change the thickness of the material you're using, or the thickness of the rods. Yeah, I mean, it's not the prettiest looking printer on the planet, but it's pretty fun. I mean, as Ultimaker can attest to, there are definite benefits to having a non-moving bed, or a bed that doesn't move in either the X or the Y, and but there haven't really been there hasn't been like a real simple equivalent of it. I mean, Cartesian's a lot easier to make a real simplified machine, so it's nice to see this project sort of has me interested. I mean, to sort of contrast this with your previous guest, the Herculean or whatever. I mean, that thing's it took you like a year to build that thing. It's got so many parts.
Yeah, it is pretty sophisticated, but it's a challenge, and obviously that's part of the RepRap community to kind of tinker and move along and just kind of communicate. And I also take the RepRap community kind of like the car community back in the old days, where my carburetor has made this thing faster than yours, and there's kind of a moniker on who's got the best 3D printer. At least that's what I came across. But so let's move on to you, Chris. I'll let you finish it off. What would you like to identify or recommend from an open source community that you really love?
I'm a big fan of Linux. Any flavor will do. Love me some Ubuntu. I run a VirtualBox on my PC, and usually fire up a few instances of Linux in the background to tackle different projects. But if you're trying to get into programming, you're learning programming, you want to learn about coding a project, I really highly recommend doing it in a Linux environment, because it just is a great way kind of to escape the confines of Windows or Mac that you might be accustomed to, and kind of break outside a comfort zone and kind of into another, kind of, I don't know, another world of computing. So I really have to say, as far as open source, I really love me some Ubuntu.
Well, and I'm going to end it with two different types, variants on that, and that's the Arduino and the new Raspberry Pi 2.
There you go.
Of them, I think both of those, actually the Raspberry Pi, I think both of those have done more to provide more functionality in the open source market than any other microcontroller out there. And now that we've got the Raspberry Pi 2, which is literally like, well, essentially is just a fast smart phone processor in a nice configurable box, I'm really moving forward to do something with that soon. So that's kind of my two items that I really am looking forward to working with. And if it wasn't for the Arduino, many of the things that we have now wouldn't be possible in this market. So that's my contribution, or at least my identification with the open source market. So on that note, I really apologize for those of you who have stuck with us. We've got 6 viewers out there, so thank you. And again, I apologize that our people out in the Midwest didn't join us. They've had some internet connection problems. In fact, Eric Lean, who was supposed to join us, his phone died, so we couldn't even get him on. I was hoping to put him on like voice.
But we'll probably follow up with them. We'll probably follow up with these guys hopefully next week, and maybe do a special edition podcast next Friday.
We'll have them as a guest crashers to kind of give us an overview. And like mentioned, John's going to send me some links to some of the videos that they did. In fact, they're running back to a hotel now to upload them. So if you're looking to see what's going on there should be up something probably in a very, and sadly, John couldn't join us today. They did try. But hopefully you enjoyed us talking about it, and I really appreciate Eric coming in at the last minute. I mean, very last minute. I think about an hour, 2 hours ago as when I contacted him, I'm thinking, well, I know it's late in there. So I'm glad he night owl and it was up. And then the same thing with Brad. Brad was like 2 hours ago, and I'm thinking, well, I hope Brad. So otherwise, you would have just been hearing Brad. It would just been an extended Friday episode. But luckily, we've had some people actually talk about the open source and RepRap. It's a great movement, and we've had lots of people on, and a lot of people who have actually made a little money off of it. Maybe not a lot, but it's moving forward. It's an opportunity, and as I said earlier, it's kind of like the personal computer market back when Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, were working out of the garage, which I heard was a myth. That wasn't really their garage. But others as well. In fact, if you go back even further, who remembers Hewlett-Packard's? Hewlett and Packard, I guess that was both of them. They were supposedly working out of their garages too to develop a lot of the initial test equipment they've worked with. And I've worked with a lot of the test equipment back in its day, and I actually have an HP computer. So on that note, I'm going to stop rambling. Again, thank you, Brad. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, nice to be here.
That's it. Sign us off, Chris.
We'll see you next week on another episode of All Things 3D.
Bye.